Good morning, everyone. Welcome on behalf of the board of the Association Forum and our staff. We're pleased to welcome everybody's participation today. Thanks for taking time on a Monday morning to discuss these very, very important issues. The topic of civil discourse couldn't be obviously any more timely and frankly more urgent than we are right now. And when you think you've seen the worst, then you see more. And it's really everybody I talk to, it's a time of stress and anxiety and really a hope and aspiration that we could get back and discuss the issues that matter and somehow find a way to tamper down some of the difficult discussions that are happening in our society. This topic came about from several different tracks. First, for quite a while through the ASAE Power of A committee, there has been an initiative to really build awareness and competence and resources around civil discourse, and we'll talk about that later. But that's been a very proud effort coming from the Power of A committee and from ASAE. At the same time, the Public Policy Advisory Committee of the Forum, chaired by Greg Heinrich, has been very active at work looking at the landscape in Illinois, in Chicago, and really more broadly. And we felt that it would be very helpful for the Forum to really engage a discussion on civil discourse because, again, it's very timely, especially as we head into this changing political environment. So with that, I'm pleased we have four great panelists today. I'm going to do a very brief introduction of the four panelists, and then they're each going to spend about 4 minutes providing some points, some reflections, some guidance, and then we'll enter into a broad discussion. I encourage you to submit your questions via Q&A or comments via chat. I will do my best to monitor those, as will the forum staff, and we'll make sure that your questions and comments are heard. First, it's my pleasure, and I'll go down and introduce each person. Mary Kate Cunningham serves as the Senior Vice President of Public Policy at ASAE. In this role, she oversees ASAE's federal, state, and local advocacy efforts on behalf of 50,000 trade association, professional society, and industry partner members. She has just a tremendous portfolio, and noteworthy that she was named in 2019 a leading association lobbyist by Association Trends. Greg Heinrich is the executive director of the Society of Actuaries since 2007, based here in Schaumburg, Illinois. He serves as chief executive for the organization and provides oversight for an organization that has more than 31,000 individual members and nearly 40,000 students worldwide. And I've never heard more from the actuary profession as I have over the last couple months in so many different areas. So we're very much looking forward to Greg's comments. Greg is very active in the Association Forum and leads our Public Policy Advisory Committee. Arlene Pietriton is PhD, CAE, serves as Chief Executive Officer of the American Speech Language Hearing Association, which is a professional, scientific, and credentialing organization for over 211,000 audiologists, speech language pathologists, and speech, language, and hearing scientists and students. She is a past chair of ASAE and remains very involved globally with the organization, and currently serves as chair of the Power of A committee and is a 2018 recipient of ASAE's Key Award. In Irving Washington, FASAE CAE, he is executive director for the Online News Association. I'm eager to learn more about that, Irving, and your comments. It's the world's largest membership organization of digital journalists. Before this job, he worked for the National Association of Black Journalists and the Radio, Television Digital News Association. And he's a member of ASAE's Diversity Executive Leadership Program and DELP, and has many honors also to his name. So welcome to our panelists. And now I'm going to kick it off with Mary Kate Cunningham. Each has 4 minutes, and then we'll go through the panel. Mary Kate?
Thank you so much, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here and be with all of the association professionals that I work for. So thank you. ASAE created a civil discourse initiative because our members, some of them here, saw a need for associations to take a leadership role in this. And by our nature, associations bring together diverse viewpoints, often fierce competitors, and set standards and lead for the entire industry. So we think it's a hallmark of associations to, by our nature, bring together diverse viewpoints, recognize there's more than one way to get things done, and move forward in industry and profession. So we have worked with the National Institute for Civil Discourse, and they have a lot of great resources, and they understand associations are really a force multiplier for civil discourse because they are trusted institutions in a world where there's diminished trust overall. I think associations are still seen as some of those groups that, regardless of party affiliation or background, they bring together communities. So we have a episode of our Stronger by Association podcast that we just taped that's live now, where we interview the National Institute for Civil Discourse and a couple other interesting leaders from academia and politics to talk about how we can tackle civility and I think put more into action on some of these issues. And we also joined Association Trends and the U.S. Chamber and the DHS Election Security Department to do a session about how associations can help be a stabilizing force in society, especially around the election. I think we're going to have some really tough times coming up. So keeping associations serving as those community leaders. And I think people look to us to be a calming influence. So there is a lot going on. There's, regardless of the outcome of the election, this will be a big issue for us going forward. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what our other panelists are sharing from their own organizations.
Great, thank you, Mary Kate. Greg?
Thank you, Paul, and thank you to the Association Forum. Really happy to be here and happy to share our perspective. I agree with Mary Kate that associations really are a natural place for these conversations to occur. For many people, maybe most or all of our members, professional associations are the way that they advance their careers, often the way they get into their careers. I have heard many stories over the years from our older members, our much older members, many of them Jewish, for example, who talk about a time when our exam structure, our exam pathway was the only way they could get into a profession when they were denied access to many other professions and many other avenues to get into professional work. So, it's a role that associations have played. The challenge today, of course, in the U.S. Is a little different. We have clear challenges, at least my organization does, in providing openness and opportunity and availability to Black and Latinx populations. The barriers are different, but fundamentally, it's the same problem, in effect, that some of my older members are talking about from their history. A couple things about our organization and the journey that we've been on. We've been on aspects of this journey for a little while. We have a program called Math Motivators that ASAE recognized a few years ago that is a terrific program providing math tutoring to students in underserved schools. In last full year, in 2019, we reached about 1,000 students around the country in about 25 different cities. Using probably about 600 or 700 volunteers to actually do mathematics tutoring for kids as young as middle schoolers. So there are things that we've been doing. We've also done some research on the barriers to entry to our profession, trying to understand exactly what it is that is keeping students in underserved populations from being able to come into our profession. And our numbers are not great at the moment, like probably a lot of other STEM related professions. We think we've got probably no more than 3% of our members are Black, and about 3% are Latinx. So we've got a long ways to go in terms of what we're dealing with. A couple of things that we're working on right now have to do with building alliance with other partners, addressing the financial need issues, training for staff and volunteers, creating some measures and benchmarks, and trying to encourage through our meetings conversations that need to happen. For instance, we just completed our annual meeting last week, and one of our keynote speakers was the author Ta-Nehisi Coates, who talked to us about some of the issues that he sees in our world today. There was nothing especially actuarial in the comments he was offering, but our members, like I think members of all associations, need to better understand the world that they're living in. So that was really important. Another issue that we've got that's maybe a little different at the moment than some of the rest of you, we're certainly dealing with it, and I won't say a lot about it, but I'm just raising it as an example of kind of things associations can confront. We have a member who was involved in the incident that occurred in Central Park last Memorial Day weekend. That matters now in the legal system, but it certainly raises questions about, and we've had questions raised with us about, where does a professional code of conduct come into bear in a circumstance like that? And it's an interesting question. Employers often, when they see behavior by their employees that they don't approve of, will go ahead and take action. But I suspect that most professional associations have not typically regarded their professional codes of conduct and standards as governing behavior, personal behavior, private behavior that is truly outside of any connection to the profession itself or professional activity. So that's an interesting issue that I know we're confronting right now and dealing with. Final comment I would make is just really reference a comment that Ta-Nehisi Coates made at our meeting last week. He was asked about his optimism for changes in discourse and dialogue and progress on these issues after the election, depending on how the US elections turn out. And he said, well, I'm always trying to be optimistic about these things, but he said, I think we should all recognize that Europe has struggled for over 2 millennia with the issue of anti-Semitism. And the worst incident, the worst actions related to that happened near the end of those 2 millennia. So we should not think that it's going to be easy for us to make progress on all of these issues. These are long-term issues, and they take a lot of effort and a long time to address. So, Paul, I'll turn it on over to the next speakers.
Greg, that was great perspective. Arlene.
Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I echo the thanks to the Association Forum for hosting the opportunity to talk about this really important topic. And it is an honor and a privilege to be here with the fellow panelist. Just to elaborate a bit on why this is an important topic, it's already been mentioned, some of the surprising, and I think some of us would say egregious comments we hear from folks who are in leadership roles. Also, and not that any one of these things are the sole driver, but the incredible rise in use of social media and the anonymity that's associated with that vehicle. A couple of years ago, well, actually, I guess just a little over a year ago, the Anti-Defamation League did a survey, and 53% of Americans said that they had experienced hateful speech or harassment online. Within ASHA, the American Speech Language Hearing Association, we've done a survey of our members and found very similar data. About 53% of our members indicated that they had experienced uncivil discourse. So, I think this is, to the points that has been made and that all of us observe, this is something that is becoming more pervasive. And so being thoughtful about what our role is personally and collectively has never been more important. I echo and underscore the comments that were made about the role of associations. Engaging in the respectful exploration and discussion of differing points of view is fundamental to how we function. If we reached an impasse in our efforts to in decision making and just said we can't come to a conclusion, we're not going to do anything about this or that, we would cease to exist. It's not an option for us, and I don't think it should be an option for other entities, other sectors, and certainly not for elected or appointed leaders in our civic and communities and in society overall. So I think we do have experience with this. It's fundamental to how we operate. We have the opportunity also, not only the necessity to do this well in how we operate, but also the opportunity to help foster these skills in our members so that we all can be good citizens in our larger communities. It has a special meaning for my association, American Speech Language Hearing Association, because our vision is to make effective communication, which we consider to be a human right, accessible and achievable for all. So if you aren't able to communicate in a civil, respectful manner, you're not engaging in effective communication. So this is a topic that is important to ASHA. A couple of things that we've done recently. Last year, we launched an online civility toolkit. It's available on our website. You can just go to www.asha.org and search for it. It has some guiding principles. It has some tools. It provides some scenarios. We are in the stages now of looking for opportunities to promote that, not only across our 211,000 members, but through our state organizations. They are not chapters, but they are affiliated entities with us. Greg mentioned a couple of challenges that are associated with this topic. So one very currently now in our space for ASHA is the walking a fine line to not go political, but to be responsive to our members' expectations that we speak up and help set the record straight about the topic of stuttering. You've heard that mentioned in political comments, and there was a newscaster in Indianapolis, I won't mention his name, but who was particularly disrespectful of individuals who stutter. And we did issue a statement. It, as I said, required us to walk a fine line. So it was clear that we were speaking up in respect for the rights and skills and talents of individuals who stutter without taking sides in political campaign. And then the last thing I'll mention is, and again, this is related to social media. In the last 6 months, in 2020 in particular, we have received several petitions from members asking or demanding that we take certain actions. It was interesting to us, or surprising and concerning, to receive communications from members in that format, as opposed to an email or a phone call or a letter to our president or to me as CEO. We have been open and in fact have moved forward with actions in some of the areas that have been requested, but that is not the typical way that we would expect to hear from members and for members to engage with us and let us know what their concerns and expectations of us are. So I'll stop there, Paul. Thank you.
Great, Arlene, that's great stuff. And the comments I'm hearing really from you all tee up some great discussions. Irving, your perspective.
Yeah, happy to contribute. This is going to be a good discussion. Hi, everyone. My work in civil discourse this year really it's been centered on having more conversations about race in the workplace, which I think is important, and two examples of that. One actually came from a personal space. It's called Text the Table, which is a web show, podcast, and conversation series that uplifts stories about race and leadership from the Black experience. I co-founded it with Dante Shannon, Michelle Mills, Clement, and Sean Boynes, all friends of Association Forum. And, you know, it was interesting. It really came from a personal space. And I said, this is a personal project. And it came during the height of the George Floyd murder and Black Lives Matter movement. And what was happening is we were having these conversations within our own group chats and messages about, you know, what it is like to be a Black leader in this moment, the challenges, the struggles, just everything we were going through. And we were all navigating it very differently. But we were there, we were helping each other. And at some point, we had a conversation where we said, these conversations need to come out of our phones. And we didn't call it this at the time, but essentially they need to come into public discourse, right? And so we felt strongly that people of all backgrounds needed to see that we're no different than George Floyd. We are George Floyd. That could have been any one of us. And despite you know, being on a panel with esteemed colleagues like this and all of our external professional awards, you know, Black professionals all across this country face racism every day, and that's still in 2020. So we essentially created the platform for this discourse, and you know, a big testament to that work really has been in the dozens of messages we received from Black professionals, leaders of color, and it's been saying, I felt seen in a way that I haven't felt before. Thank you. And so that work has been rewarding. And then flipping it to my daytime job, full-time job being executive director and CEO of the Online News Association. Just last month, we launched an initiative. It's called Vision 25. And Vision 25 is essentially seeking out to be what we are calling institutions of belonging. And by that, we mean organizations that are collaborative, people feel like they belong, they're anti-racist, and they're actively working to combat systems of oppression internally inside of their organization. And that was a big statement for us to make as an organization, which is primarily founded on technology and journalism. And so essentially what we are doing is creating conversations, uncomfortable conversations about race within journalism. And when you think about journalism, journalism is really interesting, particularly in the context of this conversation as well too. Journalism essentially was founded on civil discourse. And the fact that we present information, we give you all sides of the story, and you you tell that. And journalism is for us to make this statement, it also is big because in terms of systems and institution, journalism, we go back to the Constitution. We're one of the only professions listed in the Constitution. So in terms of systems and structures, we have a lot of baggage there. So part of this, and I think where this overlays into associations and what you're starting to see now is that for my profession, journalism, and for associations, there is power in who sets the platform for discourse. You know, for example, I don't think anyone today would say we're going to open up a conversation for discourse on should women vote or should we have integrated schools. And I think we all collectively will agree that that's not the platform for discourse that we're going to have. And so I think what's changing now, and I think what you're starting to see is that our community at large, our society, is recognizing the power that we hold either as institutions, associations, journalistic organizations into determining what gets that discourse. And so I think this is where you're seeing some of that rubber meets the road. And for me personally, what, you know, how I've gone about thinking about that question, because again, the two examples I gave, those are pretty easy. I think regardless of what your thoughts on that, I think we're all going to collectively agree we're not creating space for that. For some issues that aren't quite as clear cut as that, for me, what I do is I look at where do I want to be as a person, and where do I want my organization to be on the side of history 50 years from now when this discourse is getting discussed.
Great. These are great comments. Let me first encourage people to questions and comments. And we have one from an attendee. Let me read this and see if this is something we can address. One big challenge in civil discourse is the misinformation that many people are receiving. People are often very angry and have trouble managing their emotions, sometimes because the information they have is incorrect. For example, during protests this summer, people online were arguing about what was actually happening in the streets at that time, the facts. Are there things we could do to help with this? In other words, people saying different versions of different perceptions of what's actually happened, perhaps reported by two different ends of the media. So, Irving, maybe starting there. Is it Antifa, or is it legitimate protest? How do we navigate that?
Yeah, anyone who has the definitive answer to this, come on to my side of the pond. You will be greatly admired. So obviously journalism is dealing with this in a huge way. Like, this has essentially been the context of my entire sort of ED run with ONA. This is not an easy answer, and I don't want to claim that I have the answer to this. Here's what my recommendation is for associations. There's only so much that we can control. We can't control all the information that people are getting. And I think one of my panelists touched on this. We have to go above and beyond to become institutions that people trust. There's a huge mistrust in institutions right now. So any and everything that you can do to become an organization that people trust. So when there is misinformation and you clarify that, they believe you. One example on our side, since the 2006 election, there's a new organization that was founded. Even though this is based upon journalism, I think any association could learn from this. It's by a person named Sally Lerman. She has the Trust Project, and essentially she did a huge research on, and I know ASA has also done this work as well too, but huge research on what are the indicators, right? And she's come up with indicators of what creates a trustful organization, transparency in a way that we've never done before. For example, people want to know who are the reporters on the story, what are their backgrounds? That's different for journalism. So I think we have to think about that on the association side too.
Great, that's very, very helpful. Arlene, do you have a perspective on that question as well?
Yeah, thank you, Paul, and thanks, Irving, for those comments. So two things. One is, I think there's a different dynamic, whether it's something that you are considering doing on a reactive basis or a proactive basis. So on the reactive basis, and I think Irving touched upon this, I think it's important, and maybe my example when that I shared about being called upon to help set the record straight with regard to a communication difference. Really be thoughtful. Are you, is this legitimately in your wheelhouse? Are you a credible source? And use that opportunity sparingly and try to do so in a way that is truly objective and not taking sides. That could not be perceived as taking sides. So that's a little bit on the reactive part and the setting the record straight. And then on a proactive side, when Mary Kate mentioned a podcast that ASAE recently did, and some of the entities, the people who have a lot of experience in promoting and actually teaching and fostering civil discourse, I was really struck by the commonality that we heard time and again from these experts, and that is start with something in common. So if you're bringing, and again, we in the association community, that's an advantage we have, because in professional societies, what we have in common is our profession, our careers. So if you're looking at a community issue, then start with a conversation about why do we live in this community? What do we value about our neighborhood? But find that element to start the conversation where there can be some sense of there are some shared interests, so that folks aren't coming into the conversation only focusing on the things that they disagree about.
Great. Greg, I saw your hand up on that one.
Well, I was just going to build on both Irving and Arlene's comments. I do think that we are in a moment that there's just obviously there are a lot of tensions. Arlene mentioned getting online petitions from members. We haven't had that yet, but when I do get comments from members on some of our efforts in this area, they tend now to come in 7 and 8 page diatribes, as opposed to, an email or a phone call or something of that nature. And I think most of certainly the vast majority of my members, and I suspect of most professional associations, don't want to see us as political organizations that are always involved in the political space. So I think trying to maintain a sense of calm in response, transparency is critically important. I agree with Arlene about finding areas of agreement. And I also agree about the importance of discussing these issues. That's why, as I mentioned earlier, we felt it important to have some sessions at our annual meeting that deal with these issues, even though they are not technical. We could have chosen to just have more technical sessions, and they would have been well subscribed and people would have gotten, CPD credits for it and so forth. But we feel like it's important to provide a space for some of these conversations to happen. We're at a moment in time when that's simply important to be done.
I think one piece of advice from that I've always heard from is, I think calling, if you get a really angry member who's upset about an action you took, I think calling them back rather than emailing always helps turn down the temperature level. You can, again, as Arlene said, reference what you have in common. When ASAE opposed the White House executive order stopping diversity inclusion training, we had, we have a lot of different members with different opinions. So had some conversations about why we did that. And I think trying to double down on clearly explaining your reasoning for taking the action, why it's in your wheelhouse, as Arlene said, was really important.
That's interesting. It's what occurs to me, and your comments all reflect this, is that you can't stand on the sidelines in this time. That we're all being called upon because of our expertise or the perspective of our groups to weigh in on things that in the past we wouldn't have viewed as necessarily political. But then in this environment, we're there. And Irving, I love these resources around the trustful organization. But we're being asked to be there because of the credentials and depth that we bring. In my own sphere, of course, a hot item. There's so many in the medical space, but masks have become a tremendous political symbol. And early on, we felt it was important to try to put out the science and really encourage discussions between doctors and the public around wearing of masks. Let's move on. There are a couple other questions here that I think are very, very timely. One is, this is from Martin Downs. Do you see any differences between the responsibility of professional associations versus trade industry associations? What do you all think? And maybe on this one, we'll start with Mary Kate, since you have the big perspective of ASAE.
I'm starting with the effort to more vocally support Black Lives Matter this summer. I've seen trade associations take on more of a role in a lot of these issues. And I think it's because the consumer base is demanding it now. We see companies taking more of a political stance than they used to. So I think that's really interesting. But it still probably reflects each industry that they're in. But I've just heard some trade execs who have taken a strong stance on some of these issues, just telling about the positive and kind of negative feedback they've received. So I think it actually is more similar to professional societies than we might think.
The other perspectives, I think we all, around the table represent professional societies for the most part. But what do we think, is there a difference? Arlene?
Candidly, I don't know. To your point, Paul, never having worked for a trade association. However, back to some of our earlier comments about fundamental aspects of how associations function. There are areas of common interest, and then there are diverse perspectives on the right approach, the right way to pursue an opportunity or to address a challenge. So I think whether you're representing companies or individuals, you still have to have that capacity, that skill set to be able to really foster genuine, robust, and civil exploration of complicated topics and issues. So I would think this is every bit as important to trade associations as it is to professional societies. But that's an assumption on my part.
Greg?
Well, my perspective is I have worked for both trade and professional organizations. I spent the first 23 years of my career working on the trade association side and the last 13 or so on the professional society side. I think on the trade side, of course, those organizations are driven by the industries that they're in. The members are, or corporate entities typically. And I think that what I agree with Arlene. I think it's just as important there, but I think it's a different issue. It will be seen as an industry position, as a statement of where an industry is trying to be. One of the observations that I've seen on the professional society side in my time here is just how personal it is. You're dealing with an individual person's career, with their credentials. And so it can be, in my experience, harder to find what the position of the organization should be. And you'll be dealing with very deep individual emotions that I typically did not tend to find over on the trade side, where it was much more modulated through a corporate position. But I think the issue is quite important to both. It'll just manifest itself in different ways.
Absolutely. And Irving, perspective on that particular question?
Yeah, my organization is a professional organization, but I think if you look, we're on the cusp of something, and then this is what's making this difficult, because we can't necessarily look to the past as to what the playbook is to the future. So when I think about trade organizations, look at, and then kind of go to my earlier point about what side of history do you want to be on. Look at Nike when they supported Colin Kaepernick. They got a lot of flack for that. That was not a majority opinion. That was from a corporation, to the point earlier. If that was an association, that would have spoke to an industry. That does not nicely fit in a member survey to say, should we do this, which is our kind of operating model. However, in 2020, how many corporations have said Black Lives Matter, right? And so I think what, when I think about trade associations, I think that's where you kind of have to do some foresight about where you want to be, and be okay if not everyone is with that vision. And that's where we're on a cusp of something that's just different than what it's been before.
Exciting stuff. Let me interject. My own question. There's some really good ones coming through, but how do you get started? On this journey. I think of associations like ours, all fairly large, with members on multiple sides of the spectrum. And 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it wasn't. Things have changed. And all these issues have come to the surface. How do you, making it, you feel that the seams and stressors, the forces that are in society at large, are really taking place in our organizations. And Greg and Arlene, you gave great examples of that. How do you get started on this journey? If you're a CEO, we're all, we're feeling the challenge. But what's the first and second thing you need to do in order to introduce the conversation, build support for the conversation, begin to build some strategy around it? And maybe I'll start with Arlene.
Well, I can share a couple of thoughts in that regard, Paul. So what we did at ASHA was, and we're a staff of 300, so we are a large staff association. We began a conversation among staff. What are we observing? How does this relate to our mission? Again, back to our vision that acknowledges effective communication. Is there a role for us? Is it that we exist in a civil society and we should be good citizens as an organization and our members? Or is it that there's some fundamental connection on this issue, this topic, to our professions and the vision and the purpose of our organization? So we concluded that in our case, both of those elements applied. And so then we engaged our board of directors in a conversation, made a commitment to develop a civility toolkit for members. We also, as a workplace, launched a series of civility tips. That's not exactly what we called them. I will say both that within the workplace and the member-facing efforts did get slowed down a bit because we had launched them toward the end of last year, 2019, with the intention of campaigns in 2020. And then, of course, COVID hit us, and then we became very committed and very engaged in dealing with opposing racism and championing equity. But we are now back to a point where we're putting some focused energy. So we've developed a toolkit. We've done some promoting of it to our members. We'll be stepping that up. I think I mentioned earlier, part of that includes conversations with state speech language hearing associations. We've also adopted a code of conduct, or in the process of a code of conduct for meetings, because we have a code of ethics. But we wanted to build on that to be a bit more explicit, that when you come to an event that is hosted or organized by ASHA, that there are expectations of how people treat one another within those experiences, whether they're in person or virtual. So those are some hopefully specific examples of things that that we're doing, and I would say early stages, but I think meaningful steps.
That is really very helpful. Helps conceptualize, how you begin the journey. Greg, sounds like you some of those same elements I hear from you as well, right?
So many of the same elements, and I really appreciate Arlene's comment that it is a journey, and there are many stages of that journey. I would just comment, in thinking about our recent times, I mentioned a couple of programs that we've had underway for some years now, 3-4 years, and are making good progress with them. Our Math Motivators program and some of the barriers to entry research and so forth. But when George Floyd was murdered this summer, it was not immediately obvious to me that the world was waiting to hear what either I or my society thought about that. We all have human personal reactions to it. I think everybody I've come in contact with was obviously as appalled as anyone about it. So our organization, a little ways into that, maybe a week or so after that, we issued a statement, like a lot of organizations issued statements about it. And it took us, maybe 3-4 days, 5 days to hear from our members and our staff that we had not gone nearly far enough. That, our initial statement had platitudes in it. It was very general. It expressed horror at what was going on, but it didn't talk about anything about what we might do. And so being willing to listen to that feedback is an important first step. We took from that, the next step was another statement that was much more personal, that was much more specific, that talked about specific things that we were going to start to do our part. And essentially, I guess what we found was that maybe it's just the moment of time we're in, but there was a hunger for our institution and for us as leaders in that institution to have something to say about this. We're not separate from the world. We live in the world. And so, yes, we've launched all sorts of programs since that time, but the first step was that realization, and that required conversations with our board, with our executive committee, among our staff leadership, to say, yes, this is a moment that we have to actually speak on this. We can't just observe it. It's not a parade going by. We're in this. So that to me was a really important step that anybody who's going to jump into these things has to be willing to take on.
This is powerful stuff. So, here you have, strong educational, professional, scientific missions, but taking a step in there to say this is also important for us to do that. Irving, any additional insight on that particular question?
What I would build upon, I think Greg laid a nice framework for, is that from a practical standpoint, if you don't have a set of organizational values, that's a start right there. I presume that many people will have that. And then when you talk about discourse, I think it's hard to pull discourse apart from conversations on equity. So if you want like a practical example to do, take those values, look at some inequitable groups in your organization and literally ask them, how are we getting it right? I guarantee you will get a ton of ideas around where you are hitting the mark and where you're missing the mark. So that's just a very real practical exercise that you can do. And then secondly, I think, for journalism, one of the example of that in our field is, we have a value of obviously truth. Obviously, the variety of type of organizations now, that's debatable. We can talk about that another time. But one of the things that was really difficult over the course of the last, particularly 4 years, is if you look at, and again, not to be political, but in the beginning of the Trump administration, there was a claim that this was the largest inauguration ever. And so journalists reported that as stated. And where an evolution came is that if you're saying it is truth, even if it's the president of the United States, if it's not truthful, you do have to call it out. And so I think when you think about associations, I don't know if it's necessarily always taking a stand, but we can't take this, we're just here to to provide the discourse, and then we walk away and we let it happen, which I think has been our model. We have a bigger responsibility there. And so I think we just have to kind of think through that more. And that's what people are expecting of you.
It's powerful. Mary Kate, I see you nodding vigorously. Additional thoughts on that?
I usually nod when Irving talks. So I think the text to table that Irving and a couple other co-founders created is so great. Especially for white association professionals, it should be required listening. You can watch all the episodes on YouTube, and they've had great guests. But on this issue, it just reminded me of people of color don't have the luxury of not bringing them full selves to work, and especially during a lot of these conversations. So it sometimes can be something that I think white associations professionals say, that they don't want to make something political, but life is political. So, and another point that we learned, we're trying to make some changes to different programs to have a focus on equity and inclusion, and really working with someone who's a professional in that field. So it's not just people with good intentions making changes, but actually are, following the best practices of the industry.
Great. Sounds, as I'm listening, that you have to make it in a measured way. It sounds like you're going to create conversation, and it sounds like with some people for you, some people against you, maybe people against you on all sides. And it sounds like what you need to do as a leader is engage with everybody, right? Even if you disagree and they're very angry. It sounds like, Mary Kate, to your advice, calling that person personally and engaging their conversation.
One other point I just wanted to add to that, which you just made me think about too, is I think, to the listening exercise, it really is what your community wants. And I think the challenge is going to be is you as a leader might have a different opinion than your organization. For some communities, your organizations, your community will not want you to take a stand or speak out. And you may want to as an individual. And I think that's sort of what people have to, again, it goes back to kind of listening to your community.
Great. Good. There's a good question here. We have time for a few more. I'm going to give a value comment because it's a question coming in from a member of my staff. So it's a very good question. And she asks from Kim Ellison, how do you think the big switch this year to almost all association professionals working remotely improved or harmed civil discourse with colleagues? And I think that's a great question because the work environment has changed so much. And maybe on this one, start with you, Mary Kate.
We've noticed that meetings and all types of events go more quickly on Zoom. And I think in some ways people put more thought behind what they're saying because there's a shorter conversation. But I think you do miss, obviously we all miss the real in-person interaction where you develop more trust, I think, in relationships. I was just saying to Michelle, one, thanks for holding this, and two, it's nice to feel like I'm kind of with people that I really respect this close to an interesting election, but it's not really the same like we would be in together.
Right. Other thoughts, comments on that particular question? It really is different. Arlene?
So I agree with what Mary Kate said. Again, we're a staff of 300. We've been working all remotely, like pretty much all of you, I'm sure, since mid-March. And we are fully remote. We are doing everything that we need to do, and we're doing it well. But we've also begun talking about what the experience of doing ASH's work is like and how it's changed. And we're hearing from some of our staff are thriving in the all remote environment, and others are really missing the kinds of things that Mary Kate spoke to. We're here on a scheduled basis, but those of us in this panel and many of the participants would otherwise have the opportunity, periodically at least, to happen to walk down a corridor together on the way to a meeting, or ride up in an elevator together, or sit down beside one another during a lunch break. That spontaneity of connecting with people is something that I think many of us are missing. And particularly in a workplace, sometimes those spontaneous conversations are so rich in terms of the ideas and the exchanges. So that's one thing I think we need to really be thoughtful about. The work is getting done, but is it a different experience for people about doing that work? And then secondly, I would just add something that I think is obvious for all of us, and that is these circumstances are out of necessity. There's been a lot of disruption. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of real issues to be concerned about and worried about. And I think we're all under just a lot of stress. This has not been an easy year. Some people have experienced extreme hardships. Some of us have experienced at least levels of disruption, but there's a lot that weighs on people. So I think we all need to give each other an added measure of grace. We need to try to be patient with one another, try to be supportive. And if someone is short about something or elsewhere on that continuum, I think we need to do our best to try to model respect and civility because there's a lot of stress for everybody right now.
Great. It seems that this may go on, these working circumstances and living and interpersonal circumstances may go on for a while. So those are a good point. We're kind of coming close here. Let me ask one question that was unanswered here, and I'm going to start with Greg to help with this one, and then seek a lightning round on a very specific question I have for you. But the question comes from David Westman. It's a good one. Can you comment on how associations can address what we're all seeing now, name calling and inflammatory labeling of individuals that are taking place on both sides of the political spectrum, labeling people and their opinions as either racist or terrorists that stand in the way of civil discourse? And I think we may have touched it, but how do you get it on a personal basis where you hear the name calling and try to reduce that to a more civil conversation? Greg, thoughts on that?
Well, just first, I don't think any of us can do too much about the really high level examples of that in a presidential campaign. That really is beyond our scope. But I think it's really important to set a very clear tone in our own staffs and in our own organizational conversations and dialogue about the importance of that, and simply not to tolerate moving off into those worlds. Call it out when we see it. And I'm not, by the way, precluding what Arlene already said about there are times when your organization has to step in. I'm not the least bit surprised, Arlene, that ASHA felt the need to step in on the issue of stuttering in today's political environment. That seems entirely appropriate to me. And we're trusted organizations. I think we have to speak up on some of these things.
Irving, how about you? When you see it, what should we do when you see the name calling?
Yeah, I think, again, this goes back to your values, kind of look at what that is. And then one, this probably would have been my concluding point, but one thing I think we tend to think of like both sides, like we look at it very binary, right? And I think there's always been sort of another side where not taking any stance or simply providing the platform and stepping away, that's actually been a side this whole time. right? And so now there's a variety of different, people in our community that are actually saying, I don't agree with your side of kind of being in the middle. And so I just think for each organization, you just have to decide where you want to be. And you may decide based upon our values, we are going to stay in the middle, and you have to be okay with people who don't like that. And I think the problem with associations that we're having is we're about community, and we're about, fostering all this. And so we talk about discourse, but I actually don't think we like the feeling of discourse when it's us. We want to just host the meeting of the discourse. And I think this is what we're moving into. We're in the discourse now. And I think we have to build capabilities as an organization to manage that.
Very good. Very good. I'm going to do a lightning round to wrap up and see what you think of this question. But November 4th, 5th, 6th, or maybe the following week, this election will be over. We'll have a sense of where the votes are and where the country goes from here. But there are going to be people now in a different place. This has been a polarizing time. What's your thinking about what your organization will do and what we should do as association professionals to sort of help us get back focused on the core issues? And I'll start with Mary Kate on this one. I
think letting people know that it is normal to perhaps take longer to count votes in an environment where so many of us are voting from home. That's kind of echoing what a lot of our civic leaders are saying. And I think we have to, this is kind of a profile and courage time where it really does take standing up. And then making sure as a tactical measure, just knowing where your officers and your board chair really are on a lot of these issues, because I think we are in closer contact than we've been for a long time because so much is changing and you want to make sure they have your back.
Great. Good point, Arlene.
So I would say the clarity of what and how. You have to be realistic about we're functioning under the circumstances that we're functioning under. My gosh, we've all had a lot of experience with that this year, perhaps more than ever before. So what are the things that are important that are either the opportunities or the challenges, part of the reality that we're in, and then how do we go about doing this? So, once again, I've mentioned a couple of times, one of the things that ASHA is doing is encouraging members directly as well as through our state organizations to really be thoughtful about civility, about how we engage, how we pursue professionally and personally the things that are important to us.
Great. So an active role. Irving?
Yeah, for my organization, obviously, journalists will not be twiddling their thumbs at all this week. So our role will be helping members provide, accurate information as we sort through however the elections turn, and obviously help that conversation of hopefully civil discourse. As far as associations, I'm actually going to put it on a personal front because I think a lot of the conversation has been from an organizational perspective. I think what makes discourse a little bit difficult is that we look at it at a pretty grand scale, macro scale. And if you kind of look at it from the individual perspective, what discourse conversations will you as a leader be having privately, individually with people in your organization following the election? And I think you move that needle, the more people in your organization feel comfortable to bring this discourse as a conversation and not attach positive or negative to it. It's a place in an environment, again, to institutions of belonging where people feel like they belong and can have these conversations. So I think after this election and what can you do from a personal leadership perspective, I think it's challenging yourself to maybe have an uncomfortable, what might appear to be uncomfortable conversation. You might be surprised around any type of discourse post-election.
Good point. And I think, Arlene, you made the point as well about modeling the behavior. And that's a great opportunity. Greg, final comments on that topic.
I'm going to take the same tack Irving did, take it out of the organization-wide or corporate down to the personal. I think it'll be a time for listening, for trying to engage with your people without judgment. Try to recognize the stress that people are under regardless. demonstrate a lot of empathy and frankly recognize the grieving that will be going on with people. However this election turns out, there are going to be people who are grieving the loss of their position. Its emotions are so high right now. So I think we have to recognize that and be empathetic.
We're at the end of our time, but this has been a sensational panel. In fact, there were a couple of questions we couldn't get to, and I'd like to, suggest a forum that we consider maybe regrouping at some point in the future. But this was really an outstanding conversation. So I want to thank everybody, and nearly everybody stayed to the very end, and that's a sign also of a very good discussion.